Hi. So, the poet that I chose to do this report on is William Wordsworth. And I chose him because he describes things in a way that not many other poets can. And specifically, he has a way of drawing on memory and recollection, which is kind of the main way that he writes poetry. And because of this certain way that he did it, he was really, really influential to future poets. And it's kind of important to know that he grew up in the countryside of England because that really bleeds into most of his poetry. Like, most of his poetry has something to do with either, the countryside in which he grew up in or just nature itself. And his style of writing like that was very influential. In fact, Harold Bloom, who's, like a pretty well-known poetry critic, says that whether they know it or not, most modern poets were somehow influenced by Wordsworth. He was so confident in this influence that he went so far as to say that you have read William Wordsworth, even if you have never read him, which means, basically that his influence is everywhere, even if you've literally never read his poetry. And despite Bloom, really kind of hating Wordsworth's later work, he really does like him overall as a poet. And he described Wordsworthian nature pretty perfectly he described it like a spirit that beckons us to sublime imitations or intimations or else to terrors stopping short of transcendence. And that duality is definitely one of the reasons why I chose Wordsworth. And even though the first poem I chose doesn't have that much terror in it, it definitely does show off that sublime transcendence part of his description. And it's called Written in March. And basically the premise of this poem is how it gives the feeling of just how it feels in early springtime. So, Written in March. The cock is crowing, the stream is flowing, the small birds twitter, the lake doth glitter. The green field sleeps in the sun, the oldest and the youngest are at work with the strongest. The cattle are grazing, their heads never raising. They are 40 feeding like one. Like an army defeated, the snow hath retreated, and now doth fare ill, on top of the bare hill. The plowboy is whooping anon and on. There's joy in the mountains, there's life in the fountains. Small clouds are sailing, blue sky prevailing. The rain is over and gone. So, for this poem, I actually do kind of have an object. I mean, it's a picture, or a painting, of kind of a similar time period, in a similar area. So this was a painting of the English countryside around the 1800s. I don't know exactly when it was painted, but this is like clearly not, like maybe summer or so, but you still get the basic idea that, when the snow finally goes away, the countryside is just so beautiful. But this poem, in my opinion, perfectly captures that early spring feeling, because around here, this time of year, that's kind of what Wordsworth is describing, and this kind of happens around, the end of February or early March. So this poem just feels really close to home. And throughout the poem, you can, I already showed you the painting. And what this poem does is it pretty much just shows it starts by showing perfectly normal images of something that might, things that might be happening on the country or in the countryside during this time of year, such as a rooster waking everyone up and a nearby river flowing and the sun reflecting onto the bodies of water in the area. And it shows basically just how beautiful those things are that we usually take for granted. And it shows how beautiful they are, after that long freezing winter. And then in the next stanza, there's like an image of either a field or a family working. And I say field or family because I really don't know which it's supposed to be. Because on one hand, it's the oldest and the youngest work with the strongest. That could mean that this family has children that work alongside the adults and, maybe the grandparents in that family. Because, from what I've heard, that's kind of how families on farms operate. Everyone works together. But on the other hand, it could be a metaphor for the field itself, because the oldest plants live with the youngest plants, and they live, with the most normal plants too, the ones that, the golden harvest. Um, but this metaphor just kind of shows that, whether you're a plant or, a person, you really do tend to enjoy early spring. And another really interesting way that Wordsworth describes how the life around him takes in spring is done through the cows in this poem. He describes these cows as 40 feeding as one, and I still really don't know what he means by 40 feeding as one, but I take it kind of means that these cows are, they're so sick of being cooped up all winter that they're finally, they're so happy to be able to eat actual grass, not just compacted hay. Um, and it says that they can't even raise their heads either. They're just there munching away. And it sort of reminds me of just how, it's like on Thanksgiving, you wait hours for the food to be done and it just tastes that much better just because you've waited a few hours to eat. And the next way that he describes this time of year is through the snow and how he compares it to a defeated army. And usually if anyone's defeated in one way or another, they'll retreat from the situation. They'll just either walk away or run away or drive away or whatever. And in the case of spring, though, the snow melts, making retreat like a perfect comparison because the snow is kind of retreating. And he describes it also as feeling ill, which kind of personifies it like either like an old man or just, a sick person that's basically about to die. But right after this depressing way of showing the snow's last few moments, Wordsworth gives a very uplifting image of a joyous plowboy. He goes out of his way to describe the hills bare, which is a perfect description considering there's no more snow left on top of it. And that kid must be so excited that there's no stupid snow to get in the way of his plow. And the last few images in this poem are perfectly true to what Wordsworth is best at, and that being imagery. He describes the joy in the mountains and life in the fountains. He describes how small clouds sail in the sky as if the sky was their ocean, and they're just boats, and how the rain has finally decided to leave. However, it was not only beautiful in imagery, but also in structure. It had an interesting kind of pattern of rhyme. So the first two lines would rhyme with each other, and then the next two would rhyme with each other. And then in the middle, there'd be a line that would rhyme with the last line after two more repeating lines, if that makes sense. I don't really know what that form is called, but it was a really interesting form. And then the stanza would just repeat itself, basically. And in terms of literary devices, there was a little bit of alliteration with the cock is crowing and 40 feeding like one. There was, of course, lots and lots of personification in this poem, such as the wheat fields and the retreating snow. And along with that, there was the use of metaphor in the lines about, again, comparing it to like an army and the clouds sailing. So I think this was a really beautiful poem, and I chose it just because of the beauty, but it also just made me really feel something, that, that feeling that you get in early spring. And yeah, I just really like that poem. And then the second one I chose was called The Tables Turned. And even though many people associate old poetry with, fanciness, study, this poem is literally the opposite of that. And throughout the poem, Wordsworth, he's basically saying that really to learn something, sometimes the best thing you can do is to put down the books and go outside. So for my item for this poem, I got 2 pencils. This is your brain after going outside. This is your brain after studying for multiple hours straight and not going outside. You get really worn down and useless. So be like this pencil and just go outside. Anyway, the tables turned. Up, up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening luster mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife, come hear the woodland in it. How sweet his music, on my life, there's more of wisdom in it. And hark, how blithe the throstle sings, he too is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. Spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. One impulse of the vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral and of good than all the sages can. Sweet is the lore in which nature brings our meddling intellect, misshapes the beauteous form of things we murder to dissect. Enough of the science and of art, close up those barren leaves, come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. So, in the first stanza, we basically see how Wordsworth tries to get his friend away from his studies. He says, at least this is what I think it means, that he's going to double in size if he stays there and just doesn't take a break from the books. And it's funny because contrary to like what he's trying to get across to his friend, he makes a Shakespeare reference with why all this toil and trouble. And in the second stanza, there's a beautiful description of the sun setting over the mountains in the field, and by the way he describes it as a freshening luster mellow, it kind of makes it sound like it's a new line of like laundry detergent, which I really like that description of the sun. I don't know, is a really good description. But in the next line, he describes it as kind of spreading over the fields, which, in my opinion, is a perfect description of how the sun sets. Like, it basically spreads. And even though he probably didn't intend this, I just can't help but noticing how long this person has been studying. Like, he's been studying probably sunrise to sunset. Like, this guy needs to, like, get up and go outside. After this, he describes books as really boring when compared to a local type of bird. And along with this, he talks about how there's so much knowledge in this bird's call than in any type of book. And as a matter of fact, he swears his life to it, so he must be very confident that this bird contains all sorts of knowledge. And in the next stanza, he describes yet another bird that sings songs of smarts, and he invites the friend of his to let nature be his teacher. He basically expands on this later by saying that she has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. He's pretty correct by saying this because you can actually take a walk in nature and just learn a lot about the world we live in and a lot about the world that other animals live in. And it's actually, scientifically proven that going outside, taking a walk, can kind of improve the way that you study. Like, it'll kind of refresh your brain as opposed to just sitting inside studying all day. And after that line, he says, more or less what I think means that, like, as long as you're alive, you can take in this spontaneous wisdom, because he says spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, so I'm guessing it must mean that you're supposed to be alive. And the next stanza kind of confused me, because I really don't know what an impulse from a vernal wood is. I mean, it has something to do with, like, a tree, obviously, but I don't really know what that is supposed to mean. But it makes sense, though, because in the context of this poem, it says that it can teach you, about good and evil, which of course goes back to the nature of this, or the theme of this poem, because he says you can simply just not get this kind of knowledge out of books or supposedly smart people. But of all the parts in this poem, this stanza is definitely my favorite. Sweet is the lore in which nature brings our meddling intellect, misshapes the beauteous form of things we murder to dissect. This stanza becomes perfect right after the second line. He talks about how perfect nature is in itself, but at the end of the day, our stupid intellectualism gets in the way. And he says that we misshape the already beautiful form of the natural world and how we murder to dissect. And I think that's like, that part right there is the first time that someone's ever said something like, oh, I'd kill to do blah, 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 or I'd kill for a blah, 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 But I think Wordsworth is basically just saying how we just go so far to do something that really ultimately is useless, which is just the quest for information that we really don't need. And he's basically saying that we already have those answers in nature and that we really don't need to be doing much dissecting. But the last stanza of this poem is like a perfect closer for it. So he starts it by exclaiming that enough of the science and the art. Yet the description of the book as barren leaves is like, that's kind of artsy and scientific in itself. So I just find it kind of funny. But along with this, he goes to show that even though he's clearly educated, he still doesn't shy away from just putting the books down and going outside. He tells his friend one more time to just get up and come with him, and to bring him a heart that knows how to watch and receive. And of course, by watch and receive, he means just, take in nature, listen to the sounds of the birds and all that, and just take in the natural world. And I would actually like to argue that taking in nature versus taking in just information on a page, or nowadays, like a screen, it requires two different hearts. And that is if the latter requires a heart at all. And clearly Wordsworth definitely does have the heart for taking in nature. And even though this poem was themed around, giving up your studies, it's kind of got a by the books format. It's just the typical A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, so on. And that doesn't really mean it was boring, though. I really liked this poem. There was a huge amount of personification, though. And because basically every element of nature in this poem had some kind of like human intellect to it. And let's see, there was an allusion to Shakespeare with the toil and trouble line. And finally, there was the perfect example of synecdoche, when Wordsworth calls the book Barren Leaves. And even though this poem really didn't have that much imagery, or at least as much as the last one, it was still a perfect example of like a Wordsworthian point of view on life. And sometimes the best thing we can do, especially during this time in our lives where we're supposed to be studying all the time, is just to drop the books and just get the hell outside, or at least that's what Wordsworth said. And the last poem I chose was A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal. And in this poem, Wordsworth talks about someone that was pretty close to him dying, and he just can't seem to let her go, or at least the idea of her. And even though this poem is very short, it's only 2 stanzas long, it still packs one hell of a punch. A slumber did my spirit seal. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, rolled around in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees. And despite this poem clearly being about some girl he knew, it's interesting that he starts it off from her point of view, because, it's a poem about how he sees it, yet he starts it from her point of view. At least from an earthly perspective, his description of death seems pretty accurate. So a slumber inside of a coffin will seal your spirit into the ground, while at the same time, or at least it'll seal your body into the ground. At the same time, though, you have no fear, since you are dead. And after these 2 lines, he takes it back to his perspective, saying how she can no longer feel anything of this earth. Although it's kind of unclear to find out if he was talking about, like life's beautiful moments or hardships or just, day-to-day life, because he doesn't really give like a specific date. He just says earthly years. So I think he means everything, most likely, whether, it's good or bad. And along with that, he only describes her as a thing, which again makes sense because she's dead and her spirit's left her body. So at this point, she's literally just worm food. And Wordsworth touched on this kind of in the next stanza. He says how she has no motion or force and how she doesn't really see or hear anything. So if that first stanza kind of shows how her spirit was separated from her body, this stanza kind of shows how her body works itself back into the earth. In the last 2 lines, he describes how she rolls around with the earth, which makes sense because the earth spins around the sun, and now she's simply just part of the earth. And to really bring that idea home, he then says how she is with rocks, stones, and trees. And even though these are very normal things to see, I think that Wordsworth is subtly suggesting that she will kind of grow into the earth. Because the order of rocks, stones, and trees kind of makes it sound like she starts surrounded by underground rocks and kind of makes her way up to the stones, and then she eventually grows among the tall trees. And it just goes to show that despite her spirit being gone, her body will eventually work itself back into the earth. Which leads me to my next item, which is a pine cone from my favorite tree on earth, basically. And what the pine cone is it starts off in the ground as a seed, grows into you know, some kind of, you know, tree that has little pointy leaves on it. And then it eventually falls back down. And it just kind of shows that that's what happens to everyone. You know, we start, we're growing, you know, we live on this earth for a while, and then we just fall back and just decompose. And the pine cone symbolizes that perfectly. Now, in terms of structure, this poem was pretty normal. It had an A-B-A-B-C-D-C-D pattern, and since it was only 2 stanzas long, it really didn't go past that pattern. And there were many out-of-body elements in this poem. And it's a shining example of what an out-of-body experience is. And along with this, there was some personification of earthly years, as they had some kind of a touch. And I really don't know what to call it, but there was like a kind of reverse personification. And this woman, who, you know, obviously was a person, was described in earthly terms. And usually we personify the earth, but in this poem, Wordsworth kind of earth-sonified this woman. Overall, this was a really beautiful poem, and it was like poetic and scientific at the same time, which I just found really cool, and it just made for some really good poetry. And Wordsworth in general makes for some really good poetry, which is why I chose him. And thanks, guys.